Straight down and yeah, turn the volume down. Like that. No volume on the side. Like that. You have to swipe down on the side of your earpiece.
Hello.
Not that side, the other side.
Great.
Yeah, you can. Hey, Max.
Hi, how are you all?
Good, thanks.
You're all on time.
Good,
That's
thanks.
really good. Hi, Jan. I'm waving to Jan in Wales. Wow, this is good. This is quite a full screen. Hello, Janice. You're in my top right hand. Excellent. Barbara's here. Oh, Jenny's here as well. That's really good.
Hi.
Excellent. Nice to see you all. How are you all?
Great, thanks. How are you?
Good.
How are you, Meg?
I'm very good, thank you. I'm very good. I'm quite excited to get you all started the next 13 weeks. I'm not going to talk much about me because you can all go and read that on the internet whenever you feel like it. I'm just going to talk a little bit by way of introduction today as to what we're going to cover on the course. So a little bit more about the syllabus of the course. We're going to do a bit of practice in using the technology in Zoom so that everybody's familiar with how to use the chat, because we're going to use the chat quite a bit because there's so many people. It's not really that convenient for us to have that much group discussion because it takes up quite a long time. We'll do more of that on the group. Basically today I'm going to give you an intro to the course, a little bit of terminology to set you up to start the course proper next week. Okay, does that sound good with everybody?
Yep.
Yeah, right. I've got a few things I need to check first of all. One is that we're recording, because the people who aren't here will kill me if I get that wrong. And then I just need to get my slides up. So just bear with me with a sec while I do that. Whoop, there we go. I've got it up for me anyway. Okay, so the first thing we're just going to practice is using the chat. So if you can all find the chat function and just tell me or tell everyone else where you are joining from in the world. So that can be your country or your town or wherever you are. So Egypt, Denmark, West Wales, Estonia. This is amazing, actually. I was telling somebody earlier today that I've got people joining from all over the world, and I'd actually forgotten how many different countries we've got people coming from. Essex being a country, of course, Jenny. So yeah, a few in the UK, Netherlands, awesome. And Sweden, yep. And Elna is also, I'll introduce the two Swedes, Sarah Malmborg, and that's what she's called on the screen, Elna. And Elna, you're both in Sweden. Elna came to, I know Sarah because we used to keep our horses in the same area. And Elna came to work for me as a working student a little while ago. So Sweden meets Swedish people. Awesome. And Jan, do you know, Jan and Janice, do you know each other already? You can unmute yourselves if you want. You can say,
No.
Right, Janice is in West Wales. I used to teach Janice in Lancashire when she lived near Wigan. And Jan lives...
Oh, I come from near Wigan. I come from Ashton.
There you go. I knew you'd have something in common. And Jan is in St David's, Janice. She's one of my favourite people in St David's, aren't you? In West Wales. So there you go. I like to do a bit of introductions to people.
Hi, Jan. I'm in Newquay.
Oh, not far away.
Yeah, she's in Newquay. So good, excellent. Bit of introduction. So you all managed to find, anybody not managed to use the chat okay? Wave at me if you struggled with the chat. Great, okay, cool. So we will crack on then. I am going to do share screen and hopefully find the right slides. Yeah, there we go. So first thing is, if I can just get a thumbs up from somebody that they can see that okay. Yeah, you can. Excellent. Awesome. That's good. If you haven't, I don't know if I can mute everyone from here, but if you're not muted, could you mute yourself? There's a few people that I'll, oops. I won't mute myself, otherwise that won't work at all. Good. Excellent. That just means that if you have a dog bark or a partner come in and ask you what's for tea, that doesn't disturb everyone else. So what we're going to be talking about on the course is the science behind all the methods of training animals. Now, I said, if you read the blurb that we produced before we started the course, you'll know that what we don't do on the course is teach you how to train an animal. Emma is the person who does that for the hound charming side of the business, and myself and the rest of the horse charming professional team are the people that do that for the horse, pony, donkey, mule side of the business. But we don't teach you how to train animals on this course. What we do is we teach you the science of how they learn and how those types of learning are used in different methods of training, including the methods of training that we use. And we are unapologetically force-free in hound and horse charming. And I'll explain a little bit about what that means in a second. But what you will learn is a lot of the underlying principles rather than techniques, if you like, of how animals learn. And in some cases, that might help you to work out a technique that you want to use. In other cases, it might help you to understand why we've given you a technique or an approach to use for yourself. And what it will also do is allow you to evaluate other methods and techniques that people suggest to you, so that if someone suggests to you that you do something with your dog or your puppy or your horse or your pony, you'll be able to evaluate that and understand what type of learning they're suggesting you use. And I think that's quite important, even for people that don't come to us for help. So we've got horse clients that use other people for training their dogs. But what we like to do is empower you with the knowledge of what exactly those people are recommending you do. Because in many cases, what we find is there are a lot of animal trainers out there that actually don't understand the science and don't know the underlying techniques. They only have a procedure or a technique, and they actually don't understand the underlying science, which is why perhaps when their technique doesn't work for you, neither you or they know why that is. Okay, so we're going to crack on. The first thing I'm going to do is take you through the syllabus and explain my model of training. And this is the way I look at and organize in my mind the different ways that animals learn. And this is going to come up again and again as we go through the course. So every session, I'll introduce the model of training again and remind you where we are on that model. So first of all, we start with relationship. Now, relationship is at the center of everything that we do in hound charming and horse charming. And what that means is that the relationship we have with our animals is the number one factor that helps us decide what approach to take to managing the behavior of that animal. Now, that isn't always the case if you're dealing with wild animals. If you're dealing with wild or feral animals where you're not going to have an ongoing relationship, that may not be so important to you as perhaps getting that animal some kind of help with an injury. But if you want to live alongside and interact with those animals on an ongoing basis, a relationship is a really, really important part of what we do. And that's building a relationship that's based on the animal having trust in you as a human being. So that's really important to us, and I'll come back to that again and again. There are two things that come next in the model, and those are communication and motivation. And I'm going to talk a little bit briefly today about what those are, why they're important for interacting with animals, what the difference is, and why one of those is much more important than the other, and much more important than most people think. Okay. Then we're going to talk about three main sciences So if you were to start to look at the science of behavior change, you'll start to see some of this terminology used. In the first, I think it's in session 3 and 4, we talk about what the concept of habituation and then sensitization, what those things actually mean. Now, habituation is a word that gets used, it gets bandied around in common parlance. We talk about habituating to things or something becoming habituated to things, but I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail as to how that process happens, what it is, how it happens, how it doesn't happen, more importantly. We're going to talk about something called classical conditioning. That's also known as respondent learning. And if anyone's heard of Ivan Pavlov, it's also called Pavlovian conditioning. And classical conditioning is all about learning what predicts events in the world. Okay, so it's learning to notice signs and signals that something's going to happen. And animals are really good at it. They do it all on their own without us intervening at all. But there are some situations where we want to teach them signals. We want to give meaning to signals that we can use in their training. We're going to talk about the application. So the science is classical conditioning, and that describes how that process of learning comes about. But we're going to talk about the application of that technique, of that principle as a technique to something called counter conditioning. We're going to look at how we use classical to teach an animal a bridging stimulus, which most of you will know as something like a click. So you can use a clicker to make a bridging signal, or you can use a voice to make a bridging signal. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the final theoretical area, which is operant conditioning or operant learning, which I could summarize as learning by consequences. We're going to explore something called the motivation continuum, which is a useful way of understanding how animals are motivated by pain and pleasure. And that's all animals, us included. We're going to look at the thing most of you are probably familiar with, or at least have heard of, and that's negative reinforcement, positive reinforcement, and negative reinforcement and punishment. So most people who are even interested in listening to me talk about how to train animals is because you've become interested in training with positive reinforcement. But what I'm going to do is explain the different types of consequences we can create for behavior, the pros and cons of those, what is and isn't negative and positive reinforcement and punishment. Later on in the course, towards the back end of the course, we talk about what I call operant techniques, and those are ways of getting the animal to behave, to do something, to take some action so that we can reward it. Because if we're going to use positive reinforcement, that type of consequence comes after the behavior. We reward the behavior that we want. What we need to know about if we want to be force-free trainers is how do we get behavior in the first place so that we can reinforce it. And we're going to look at the 6 ways of doing that with animals and the pros and cons of each of those, and when you would and wouldn't use different techniques. We're going to look again towards the back end of the course at cues and something called stimulus control and shaping. And stimulus control is really about getting behavior on cue so that we can produce the behavior again. So teaching the dog to sit there's a learning phase and then there's a using phase. So if you want to teach your dog to sit, you'll choose a method of getting the dog to sit and you'll reward the sit. But then you want to produce that behavior again in the future. So using stimulus control is a way of getting behavior on cue. And shaping is really about how we get more behavior or more complex behavior or a different quality of behavior. Okay. And then finally, the very last session is on systematic desensitization, which is a protocol or a procedure for changing perception, usually of things that an animal fears. And we'll look at systematic desensitization, and we'll look at how we might use that in combination with other techniques to alter the perception an animal has of a situation or an event or a trigger stimulus. So that's the syllabus. So each week I'm going to tell you where we are in the syllabus and what we're going to be looking at that week. And then when we get to week 13, we'll complete the picture with systematic desensitization. Now, it's probably important to say that there are other methods of learning. I don't talk about cognition. And cognition, I would summarize cognition as the process of acquiring knowledge. Yeah. What we're talking about in this course is the process by which behavior changes as a result of experiences, rather than the capability of animals to acquire knowledge and insight, and their ability to use the knowledge that they gain. Now, there is some cognitive learning goes on in the types of learning that we're going to talk about, but we aren't going to talk about cognition specifically. It's a very fascinating, interesting and detailed subject, but it won't necessarily get you to where you can trim your horses or your pony's feet or lead them from A to B without them being frightened of the traffic. Okay, so we're focusing on the more, I would say, the more practical side of using how animals learn for their benefit to train them. Okay, so moving on. So the first thing I'm going to do is sort of position what we're going to learn about in a bigger scientific context, because what I tried to teach you is the underlying science of what's called learning theory. So learning theory is a branch of psychology that sometimes people call behavior change science or the laws of behavior. And they call it the laws of behavior the same way we would talk about the laws of physics, really. It's what are the properties of behavior and how does behavior happen in given circumstances. So what are the features of behavior and what are the ways in which behavior changes as a result of experience in the environment. And ABA, or applied behavior analysis, is what is used in the scientific community or the operational community where people practice this stuff for real, is the practical application of that science to a specific individual or group of individuals or group of learners. Now, it's probably quite interesting to note that behavior analysis is currently being used globally by insight from behavior analysis is being used globally by governments to try and influence human behavior during the pandemic. So it's a very real thing that governments are trying to do now. They're taking advice from behavior analysts to say, how do we best motivate people to observe social distancing rules? Or how do we motivate people to get themselves vaccinated so that we can make sure that we don't spread the virus? So behavior change science is in, you'll see it. I notice the way in which governments and the media are trying to influence our behavior now, because I have some understanding of the behavior change science that's being used to do that. So behavior change science, it explains the kind of learning that results in behavior change. And you could say that the sort of learning that we're looking at is the sort of learning that changes behavior as a result of experience. So the important thing to say is that if all of us, if our behavior is going to change, we have to have some kind of experience for that to happen. Okay, and we'll talk for each of the different types of learning as to what those experiences are. And learning theory, really all it does is explains how that learning happens. So you will understand things about your own behavior as a result of doing the course, as well as being able to look at your animals and understand how their behavior is changing too. Okay, So then the second question I wanted to look at is, what is a trainer? So if that's behavior change science, what do trainers do? Well, what we are as trainers are people who engineer situations in the environment to create those experiences for the animal to learn. Now, the animal is going to go away and learn on their own. You know, they're going to find out about the environment they live in. They're going to learn what happens before what happens. So the signs and signals that something good's going to happen or something bad's going to happen. So they do that, they learn that independently. But what we do as trainers is we, if you like, we interfere in that process by setting up the experiences deliberately and intentionally to teach the animal things we want them to learn. And those will be things that are beneficial for their welfare, so we can look after them and keep them safe, or that serve a purpose for the life of that animal. So if there's some purpose for which we want to have our animal, then we're going to be training the animal to do the things that serve that purpose. Okay, so whether that's an animal that's used to for scenting. So if you've got an animal that's a drug search animal that you want to use at an airport, you're going to train that animal to detect the scent of certain drugs or the scent of money. Okay, and a trainer, we would say in the charming organization, that a trainer who wants a good relationship with an animal is going to be someone who wants to do that without using force. So we're very much about force-free. Now, there isn't a definition of force-free in the science at all. For being force-free is a concept that has different meanings to different people, depending on their interpretation. In the horse charming, the hound charming world, we have a very clear definition of what it means to be force-free. And I'll share a little bit with that, of that with you first. But first of all, what I want to do is ask you what you think. So in the chat room, if you can tell me right now, what does force-free training mean to you? And tell me that in terms of two things. What would you avoid, if you want to be force-free, what would you avoid doing or using? So any tools you wouldn't use or any techniques you wouldn't use. And what would you try to do? So fire away and tell me what you think force-free means to you. I'll have a drink while I wait for somebody to type something to me. Excellent, thank you, Barbara. Barbara's got us going. So any tool that causes pain. So whips, bits, spurs. Pressure or aversives, that's great, Janice. We'll talk about what that is for anyone who doesn't understand. Tools or equipment that could cause pain. Yeah, that's really good, Robert. Give the animal some choice. That's really nice. I like that, Alna. And avoid aversives. Jan says not using punishment. Yeah. Robert, avoid yelling. That's a really good one. If it scares your dog or your horse. Oh, I like that, Jenny. That's different. Not using your own strength to make an animal do something. That's really good. I like that. That's a unique way of putting it. Shock collars. Avoid using methods causing pain and discomfort. That's great, Greta. No use of shock or prong collars. Anything, I like that, Claire, a lot. So Claire Canning said, avoid doing anything that makes the animal feel uncomfortable physically or mentally. Cheryl wouldn't use whips, but she would use positives such as food, yeah. So not using force, fear or intimidation, no aversive, no pressure. Anything the animal finds aversive, that's great, Sarah. Rachel, I like that. It's probably not Rachel, is it? It's like trying to take, Layla's saying, trying to make the animal's feelings into consideration. And Emma said, putting the animal's emotional, physical, mental well-being at the center of things. No room for ego or competition. Yeah, that's really true. So it's putting the animal above what we want or what we think is important. Yeah. Okay, that's really good. Thanks, everyone. So good chat practice. So I'm going to tell you what it means to us for the next 5 minutes. So we've got 5 minutes left on this call. And when, just so that you know what to do, when this call ends, I'll either end it or it'll end itself. just dial into the same call again and I'll meet you there. Okay, so we would say that if you're going to be force free, you will want to avoid the use of the following. So you won't use restraint. Then you use no devices that involve restraining the animal. You won't use any sort of coercion, and I'll talk about what that is. You won't be using discomfort to motivate the animal to do something to make it stop. So that would be traditional uses of negative reinforcement. You won't cause pain, you won't cause fear, you won't put them under any physical or psychological pressure. So I think somebody said that was really good. And you won't be using any kind of threatening, aggressive or chasing body language or voice. So you won't be doing traditional types of round pen training with a horse. You won't be herding them or anything like that. And these are some examples of things you won't be doing. So you won't be using collars, leads, choke collars, prong collars, shock collars, head collars, halters, rope halters, knotted halters, padded collar halters, bitted bridles, bitless bridles. You won't be pressing or pushing with your hands, your leg, your feet. You won't be kicking, you won't be hitting or waving sticks or hitting or waving whips. So none of those tools, even though we might have to use those tools sometimes for the animal's own safety, these are not tools for force-free training. They're tools really for when we haven't trained or when we can't train. Okay. The other thing we won't be doing is preventing access to something the animal values until they behave. So we don't keep them shut in the stable until they stop kicking the door and then let them out. We don't withhold food until they do something we want. We don't say, no, you can't have the feed bucket until you stand still. Yeah, those are all coercive, where you're making behavior conditional on the animal doing something, or you're making something they value conditional on them doing something you want. And that can be coercive. We're not going to cause any emotional distress or physical discomfort. We're not going to touch them in a way they don't want. And we're not going to use any kind of threatening or chasing energy, body language, or behavior. So there's no shouting, herding, lunging, driving the animal away from yourself, however gently you might think you're doing that, or towards something else, with whether it's just moving towards them or using body language gestures or ropes or sticks. So those are things that you won't see happen in force-free training, but you will see happen with a lot of trainers who think they're force-free, and that's where we're going to help you differentiate. Just because a person isn't hitting a horse or a dog, or they're not kicking a horse or a dog, or they're not pulling the horse or dog around, and just because they're riding without anything on the horse's head doesn't mean they're force-free. And what we're hoping to do is have you understand why that is. Okay, so I think what we'll do, we've got less than a minute left. So what we'll do is I'll stop this call now. I'll end the call, and then you can all jump onto the call again. So I'm going to just stop sharing, and then where am I? I'm going to end it for all of us, and I'll see you on the next call.